When the airplane flies in VNAV, the autoflight system will obey speed and altitude constraints attached to the flight plan waypoints. This is a powerful feature of VNAV and can make arrivals and departures easier to navigate. But if ATC asks you to delete an altitude constraint or change an airspeed, it can mean that you have to program the FMC when you should be looking for traffic. You can use speed and altitude intervention to make these changes. Speed and altitude intervention work only when VNAV is engaged. In VNAV, the MCP IAS Mach display is blank, and you cannot change the speed with the MCP speed selector. When you push the speed intervention switch, the IAS Mach display window will open to the current FMC target speed. The target airspeed line of the CDU shows that the MCP controls the speed. You can now change the speed using the MCP speed selector. The target speed is now 0.78 Mach. If you push speed intervention again, the IAS Mach window blanks and control of the target speed returns to the FMC. You are flying the KLAX loop departure. The FMC shows altitude constraints at kegs and COOP. The altitude constraint of 13,000 feet for kegs is in the MCP altitude window. ATC tells you that the constraint at kegs is deleted. Because there is still a constraint at COOP, enter 15,000 feet into the MCP altitude window. When you push altitude intervention, the constraint at kegs erases. If the MCP altitude is above the constraint altitude, each push of altitude intervention removes one more altitude constraint. The airplane levels at 15,000 feet to obey the FMC altitude constraint at COOP. ATC now clears you to your planned cruise altitude of flight level 350. If the airplane is at an FMC altitude constraint, altitude intervention lets the airplane resume the VNAV climb. Here the climb will continue to the flight level 350 cruise altitude. ATC clears you to a new cruise altitude of flight level 390. Set the MCP altitude to 39,000 and push altitude intervention. Continue. If the MCP altitude is above the FMC cruise altitude, the FMC cruise altitude increases to the higher MCP altitude. Here you are in a VNAV path cruise. ATC now clears you to flight level 410. Set 41,000 in the MCP altitude window and push altitude intervention. Continue. The FMC cruise altitude changes to match the MCP, and the airplane begins a cruise climb to flight level 410. If you set the MCP altitude below the current FMC cruise altitude and push altitude intervention, the airplane begins an early descent. You cannot set a lower cruise altitude with altitude intervention. Continue. In this example, the airplane flies the red-eye arrival to KLAX. There are many altitude constraints on this arrival. In the descent to Civet, the MCP altitude window shows 14,000. ATC removes the altitude constraint at Civet. Set the next lower altitude constraint and push altitude intervention. Continue. The constraint at Civet erases. ATC now removes the constraints at Bindi, Bassett, and Downey. Set the MCP altitude window to cross Santa Monica at 8,000 feet. Continue. 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 If all altitude constraints are removed from a VNAV path descent, the FMC automatically changes to a VNAV speed descent. ATC clears you to 6,000 feet and removes the altitude constraint at Santa Monica. Continue.